Stephen, whenever you feel comfortable, you can begin.
Did you know that in the United States there are over 200 major chemical industries, and this helps contribute to a global production of billions of chemicals? And with all of this production going on and contributing to our day-to-day life and the different comforts that we have available to us, there's a great deal of waste that are produced as well. Globally, there are billions and billions of grams of waste released, and you can find these terrifying statistics. But any bit of this waste that's produced is actually going to end up in our natural environment, which of course directly affects us all, because we only have one Earth. We have our waterways, our air, and our silt and soil, and that's all we have. And so it is important that the people that are designing these plants and these industries have a good awareness of the different kind of safety considerations which they must consider. So I have a relevancy to this topic because I study chemical engineering here at FSU. And many people don't know what chemical engineers do, but typically we may be asked to design a chemical plant. Say we want to produce 1 million kilograms of this chemical a year. So I want you to design what kind of plant you should do and exactly what kind of money you may be able to make with it. So when we're looking at these plants, we're trying to make money and we're trying to increase our comforts in day-to-day life. But in general, when you try to make a single product at a chemical plant, there's nothing you can do. Generally, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of undesired plants or chemicals which are also produced. And whenever you go to release these wastes to the environment, you have to have complicated machinery available to continuously monitor the level of all these streams, as well as handle any waste if necessary. So as a student here, I've studied these regulations heavily and the kind of issues that have to be taken into concern. I hope to establish to you my main point that in chemical processes which are unavoidable in our day-to-day life, that a solid knowledge of the safety considerations for our environment are very important. To begin with, the waste that we produce will end up in our air, water, and soil. Second, the importance of this has become so important, or has been underscored by the involvement of the federal government in placing a great deal of legislation. And finally, I'd like to mention that, like I said, chemical engineers are trying to make money by designing these plants, and by having to include equipment and expensive treatment methods for all of these streams, they're directly losing money. So there's a great ethical consideration that becomes involved. So to begin with, whenever we take the chemical and we release it into the air, or if we dump it into a river, no matter how, it will eventually end up in our air, water, and soil. And first thing to realize about this is that our air and our water and our soils are not separated. Just consider a river. At the bottom you have soil and silt, and then you have a boundary between soil, silt, and water. Then you've got the river where there's water. At the top you have a boundary between the water and the air, and then you have air. Right? So life inhabits all of these regions. And so whether it ends up in air, water, or soil is going to directly affect life anyway. So when you release chemicals into the air, there is a federal organization that most of you have probably heard of called the Environmental Protection Agency. And there are innumerable regulations that have been placed about the levels of certain chemicals that can be released in the air. For instance, they may say that a chemical needs to be at 10 parts per million. And perhaps none of you know what parts per million is, but all that means is that if you had 1 million grams of air, there could only be 10 grams of the chemical. When you look at rivers, nearly every chemical plant needs water to heat and cool streams. Usually they take this water straight from a river, and then there's going to be a line that's leading water from the river to the plant and also back. So in general, whenever you're going to release this back, all of us know about the fine-tuned ecosystems that we have and about the aquatic life we have. When you're going to release it back to the river, I like to introduce a term that we usually use. I don't want it to be too technical, but they often characterize the waste with something called a BOD level, which is your biological oxygen demand. Because when you have fish, they need their oxygen to survive a certain amount. The waste that they produce needs a certain amount of oxygen. The aquatic life, the plants and everything, they need a certain amount of oxygen. So if you have a waste stream that requires more oxygen to be decomposed than the fish need, you could be killing fish just by releasing your waste to the environment. So in general, we often have to know what kind of levels we can release this stuff into the water. And then on top of that, with silts and soils, everyone can tell the issue there because we have groundwater and issues of runoff and all of this stuff. So secondly, I'd like to bring up the fact that the importance in all of this environmental safety has been underscored by the federal involvement. There is, as I mentioned, an organization called the Environmental Protection Agency. There's also an organization called the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. According to modern chemical tools and emission controls, the technology and chemical industry at our hands today has left us with a higher standard of living than ever, but it's also led to a great degree of pollution of our airs and our rivers and our soils. Thus, the federal government decided that it was very important to become involved. And a good example of this for everybody is that in the 1970s, when people started realizing that the chlorofluorocarbons and our pesticides were killing the ozone layer. So this large pollution and this lack of regulation that exists for many years was starting to come into control in the 70s and the 80s. And now the chemical industries today can be fined billions of dollars just for minor infractions about having too much pollutants in their waste. Okay. Finally, the chemical engineers designing these processes, like I said, they're trying to make money. So in general, when you're trying to design a plant from the beginning, they ask you to find the net present value, which may be the value the plant's going to have in 10 years. Because you've got to purchase the land, you've got to build the plant, you've got to hire everyone, you've got to get these things running, and you may have spent $30 or $40 million at this point. And then you might not still have any money that you've made after 5 years. So in general, you have to look at what you're going to make 10 years down the line. In order to have all of these levels of pollutants monitored, to have your BOD level, like I told you, or to have the level of different chemicals, it requires expensive equipment and analyzers. And if your levels are too high, you have to have expensive treatment systems. So altogether, by incorporating the necessary environmental features that you need, you're losing money. But it's something that you have to know is ethically required of you. There are times when you can make more money by directly sacrificing environmental safety. So it's just one of those things that people have to eventually be aware of if they're going to be in this work. So in conclusion, I hope that I've made you a little bit more aware of the necessary evils that come along with the chemical production that we have. And we take everything that we have in day-to-day life for granted a lot of times, but there are lots of waste and other things that are produced as a result, and we have to be careful. So you have to realize that these chemicals are going to be going into our natural environment, and we only have one. So everybody knows that we need to be watching this carefully because it's our children and our children's children that are end up on the same planet. Secondly, the federal government has come and become greatly involved. And finally, we have to consider the effect of making money versus treating the environment like you know it needs to.
Thank you, Stephen.